There's a moment, quiet, almost invisible from the outside, when something inside you finally shifts. It doesn't come with an announcement, no dramatic exit, no final speech. Just a subtle, internal decision. You're done negotiating your worth. And the surprising part is, they feel it. Because what they were never truly attached to wasn't just your presence, it was your participation, your reactions, your willingness to explain, to fix, to chase clarity that was never meant to be given. That's where the control lived. Not in what they said or did, but in how deeply you stayed engaged with it. And the moment that engagement begins to dissolve, something changes in the dynamic. You may still be in the same room. You may still respond when spoken to. But energetically, you've stepped back. You're no longer leaning in, trying to decode every word, trying to soften every edge. You stop overthinking their tone. You stop rehearsing your responses. You stop carrying the emotional weight of the entire relationship on your shoulders. And that absence, that quiet withdrawal of effort, is what unsettles them. Because control, in this kind of dynamic, is never loud. It's subtle. It's built over time through patterns, your empathy meeting their inconsistency, your patience absorbing their unpredictability. And when you interrupt that pattern even slightly, it creates a kind of disorientation. They may not understand it consciously, but they feel it. The rhythm has changed. You see, when someone has grown used to being the center of your emotional world, your detachment doesn't feel neutral. It feels like loss. Not necessarily the loss of you as a person, but the loss of access. The loss of influence, the loss of being able to reach into your emotional space and shape what happens there. And so, they begin to sense something slipping. They may test the waters, say something provocative, something designed to pull you back into your usual role. But this time, your response is different. Or maybe there is no response at all. And that's when it becomes real for them, because what once worked no longer does. And for you, this is unfamiliar territory too. There's a part of you that wants to go back to what you know, to re-engage, to smooth things over, to restore the illusion of connection. But another part of you, the part that's been quietly observing, quietly learning, knows that this shift is necessary, that this discomfort is not a sign you're doing something wrong, but a sign that something inside you is finally aligning. You're no longer seeking permission to exist as you are. You're no longer waiting for them to meet you in a place they've consistently shown they cannot reach. And that realization, while painful, is also liberating, because for the first time, your sense of self is not dependent on their response. And that's the moment everything begins to change, not just for them, but for you. When you stop feeding the dynamic that once controlled you, you don't just disrupt their expectations, you reclaim your power. And once that shift in you becomes undeniable, once they sense that you're no longer emotionally available in the same way, something else begins to happen. There's an urgency that enters their behavior, a sudden reappearance, a message that feels out of character, a softness that wasn't there before. It can feel confusing, even disorienting, because it seems to contradict everything you've experienced up to this point. But it's important to understand what's actually driving this. When someone has relied on your emotional responsiveness, your empathy, your willingness to stay engaged no matter how you were treated, your withdrawal doesn't register as a simple boundary. It registers as a disruption, and that disruption creates anxiety. Not necessarily because they've lost you as a person, but because they've lost the dynamic that once gave them a sense of control, stability, or validation, so they reach. They might reach with kindness. Suddenly they remember the things you once longed to hear. They might apologize, or at least come close enough to an apology that it stirs something in you. They may bring up memories, shared moments, fragments of connection that once felt meaningful. And for a moment, it can feel like the person you hoped they could be has finally arrived, or they reach through concern. They ask how you are, not in the casual way they used to, but with a kind of intensity that feels new. They position themselves as someone who cares, someone who's been thinking about you, someone who doesn't want to lose what you had. And then there are other times when the reaching is less gentle, more subtle, more calculated. A comment designed to provoke you, a hint of jealousy, a suggestion that they've already moved on, hoping it pulls you back into a reaction. Because any reaction, even anger, is still a form of connection. And this is where it becomes deeply challenging for you, because these attempts don't just come from the outside. They activate something inside you. The part of you that hoped for so long that things could be different. The part of you that learned to equate attention with care, even when that attention came inconsistently. The part of you that still wants resolution, still wants clarity, still wants to believe that if you just respond in the right way, something might finally shift. But here's the truth that often takes time to fully accept. This reaching is not about transformation. It's about restoration of the old dynamic, the one where you were available, responsive, and emotionally invested in ways that cost you your sense of self, because real change is not urgent. Real change is consistent, accountable, and sustained over time. It doesn't appear suddenly in the face of loss, only to disappear once the connection is reestablished. And so, you're faced with a choice, not an easy one, not a comfortable one, but a necessary one. Do you interpret these gestures as evidence of who they are becoming? Or do you recognize them as a reaction to who you are no longer willing to be? Because if you look closely, beyond the words, beyond the timing, you begin to see the pattern. The cycle that once kept you bound is trying to reform. The door you quietly closed is being tested, gently at first, then with more persistence. And your strength in this moment is not in proving anything. It's not in explaining yourself more clearly, or responding more wisely, or giving them one more chance to understand. Your strength is in your restraint, in your ability to sit with the discomfort of not responding the way you used to, in your willingness to let the silence speak for you, in your commitment to honoring the shift that has already begun within you. Because every time you resist the pull to re-engage in the same way, you reinforce something new inside yourself. You reinforce the truth that your peace is not something to be negotiated. And that's where the real power begins to take root, not in what they say or do next, but in your decision not to be pulled back into what you've already outgrown. And when those attempts to pull you back don't land the way they used to, when the messages don't spark the same urgency in you, when your silence holds, when your responses no longer carry that familiar emotional charge, something begins to fracture. Not loudly, not all at once, but in small, revealing moments. The mask they once wore so convincingly starts to slip. You see, the version of themselves that you were given in the beginning was never random. It was carefully shaped in response to you, your needs, your openness, your longing for connection. It felt real because parts of it were real, but it was also selective. It was a presentation, not a full picture. And as long as the dynamic stayed intact, as long as you continued to meet them with the same level of engagement, that presentation could be maintained. But now something has changed. You're no longer participating in the same way. You're no longer feeding the dynamic that kept everything in place. And without that reinforcement, it becomes much harder for them to sustain the version of themselves that once drew you in. So you start to notice the inconsistencies more clearly. The warmth that once felt natural now feels forced, or disappears altogether when it doesn't get the response it expects. The patience that once reassured you begins to wear thin. There may be flashes of irritation, of indifference, even of subtle contempt that were always there beneath the surface, but now they're harder to conceal. And this can be a disorienting experience, because part of you remembers how things felt before, how safe, how connected, how hopeful it all seemed. And now you're faced with a version of the same person that feels unfamiliar, even unsettling. It can make you question your own perception. Was it ever real? Did you imagine the connection? Or is this new behavior a reaction to something you've done? But if you look closely, with the clarity that distance provides, you begin to see that what's emerging now is not something new. It's something that was always present, just not fully visible. The difference is that you're no longer filtering it through the same lens. You're no longer minimizing it, excusing it, or trying to make sense of it in a way that preserves the relationship. You're seeing it as it is. And that clarity, while uncomfortable, is deeply important, because it breaks the illusion that kept you tied to potential rather than reality. It allows you to distinguish between who they showed you they could be and who they consistently chose to be. And this is where your growth becomes undeniable, because instead of trying to restore what once felt good, you begin to honor what is actually true. You stop chasing the version of them that only appeared under certain conditions. You stop negotiating with behavior that no longer aligns with your sense of self. You stop asking, how do I get them back to who they were? And start asking, why was I willing to accept so much less than I needed? That shift in perspective changes everything. It moves you out of confusion and into clarity, out of hope rooted in fantasy and into awareness grounded in experience. And while there may still be moments of doubt, moments where the old patterns try to reassert themselves, something deeper within you now recognizes the difference. You're no longer looking at them through the lens of who you wanted them to be. You're seeing them through the lens of who they've shown themselves to be, consistently, over time. And that kind of seeing cannot be undone, because once the mask slips and you allow yourself to truly witness what's underneath, you can no longer pretend you didn't notice. And in that moment, clarity becomes your protection, and truth becomes something you no longer negotiate. And as that clarity settles in, as you begin to see more clearly what is actually happening rather than what you once hoped was happening, there's often a noticeable shift in their strategy. The warmth that didn't pull you back, the charm that no longer worked, gives way to something heavier, more pressuring, more emotionally loaded. This is where guilt begins to enter the picture, not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it's subtle, a sigh in their voice, a statement that sounds reflective on the surface but carries an undertone of accusation. I guess I was never that important to you. Or, after everything I've done, this is how you walk away. It's framed in a way that invites you to question yourself, to look inward and wonder if perhaps you've been too harsh, too distant, too ungrateful. And that's not accidental, because when direct control no longer works, indirect influence often takes its place. If they can't reach you through connection, they may try to reach you through responsibility, through obligation, through the part of you that has always been sensitive to the emotional states of others, especially those you've been close to. You may also notice blame becoming more explicit. The narrative starts to shift. Where once there may have been some acknowledgement, however limited, of their role in the dynamic, now the focus turns toward you. Your reactions are highlighted. Your boundaries are questioned. Your silence is interpreted as cruelty, your distance as abandonment, and if you're not careful, this can pull you back into a familiar position, the one where you begin to defend yourself, to explain once again why you feel the way you do, to justify your need for space, to soften your stance so that they don't feel hurt. But this is where awareness becomes essential, because what's being activated in you is not just about the present moment. It's connected to something deeper. Many of us have learned, often very early in life, to equate being good with being accommodating, to feel responsible for the emotions of others, to believe that if someone is in pain and we are connected to them, then it must be our role to fix it, to ease it, to make it better. And that belief, while it may come from a place of empathy, can also be the very thing that keeps you bound in unhealthy dynamics, because it makes it difficult to distinguish between compassion and self-abandonment. You can care about someone's feelings without taking responsibility for them. You can acknowledge their pain without agreeing that you caused it. You can step away from a situation that is harming you, even if the other person experiences that as loss. And that's a hard truth to sit with, because it challenges a deeply ingrained pattern, the idea that your value lies in how much you can endure, how much you can give, how much you can carry for others. But real strength, real healing begins when you start to question that idea, when you begin to ask yourself, at what cost? At what cost do you keep explaining yourself to someone who has shown little willingness to understand? At what cost do you continue to absorb blame that doesn't fully belong to you? At what cost do you stay in a dynamic that requires you to shrink, to doubt, to disconnect from your own needs? Because every time you override your own experience to maintain someone else's comfort, you move further away from yourself. And the work now, the deeper work, is not about convincing them of your truth. It's about staying connected to it, even when it's challenged, even when it's misunderstood, even when it's met with resistance. You don't need their agreement to honor your boundaries. You don't need their validation to recognize what you've experienced. And you don't need to carry guilt for choosing to protect your well-being, because when you begin to see guilt not as a signal that you've done something wrong, but as a signal that you're doing something different, something that breaks an old pattern, that's when it starts to lose its power over you. And in that shift, something steadier begins to take its place, a quieter kind of confidence, one that doesn't need to argue, doesn't need to prove, doesn't need to persuade, it simply knows. And that knowing becomes your anchor in the midst of everything that tries to pull you back. Because when you stop confusing guilt with responsibility, you finally begin to stand in a place that is truly your own. And when those efforts, pulling you back with warmth, with guilt, with blame, no longer have the effect they once did, there's often another shift. It's quieter on the surface, but it carries a different kind of weight. The communication slows or stops. The tone turns cold. There's a distance that feels intentional, almost performative, as if your absence is being mirrored back to you. This is where the dynamic can become particularly confusing, because after everything, the intensity, the pursuit, the emotional pressure, you're suddenly met with silence, or indifference, or a version of them that behaves as though the connection meant very little, and that contrast can be difficult to reconcile. It can make you question what was real, what mattered, and where you stand now in their perception. But this, too, is part of the pattern. When control can't be regained through engagement, it often shifts into withdrawal, not necessarily as a sign of peace or acceptance, but as a different form of influence. Because silence, when used this way, is not neutral. It's designed to create space where your thoughts begin to fill in the gaps, to provoke uncertainty, to stir the part of you that seeks closure, that wants to understand, that feels unsettled by the lack of resolution. And that internal response, that pull toward making sense of things, is where the dynamic can quietly reestablish itself. You may find yourself wondering why they haven't reached out, replaying conversations, questioning whether you misread something, whether you were too firm, too distant, too final. You might even feel the urge to break the silence, just to restore a sense of familiarity, even if that familiarity was painful. But this is where the deeper work continues, because what you're being invited to do in this moment is to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, without rushing to resolve it, to allow the silence to exist without interpreting it as a reflection of your worth, To recognize that someone else's withdrawal does not define the value of what you offered or the reality of what you experienced. And that's not easy, because many of us have been conditioned to associate silence with rejection, with abandonment, with something we need to fix. But not all silence is a problem to be solved. Sometimes it's a boundary being tested. Sometimes it's a space that reveals more truth than any conversation could. And if you look closely, beyond the immediate emotional reaction, you begin to see something important. The same person who once needed your constant presence, your attention, your emotional availability, is now capable of stepping away without explanation, of becoming distant without acknowledgement, of behaving as though the connection can be turned off as easily as it was turned on. And that realization, while painful, brings clarity, because it shows you that the consistency you were seeking was never truly there, that the connection you were trying to preserve was not being held with the same care on both sides, and that your decision to step back was not a disruption of something stable. It was a response to something that was already unstable. So the silence, in a way, becomes revealing, not of your inadequacy but of the dynamic itself, and in that space you're given an opportunity not to react, not to chase, not to re-engage in the same way, but to anchor yourself more deeply in what you've come to understand, to let the silence pass through you without pulling you back, to allow the absence of their voice to make room for your own, because the more you resist the urge to fill that silence with old patterns, the more you create space for something new to take root within you, a steadiness that isn't dependent on their presence, a sense of self that isn't shaken by their withdrawal, and a clarity that doesn't need constant reassurance to remain intact. Because when you no longer respond to silence as a call to return, it loses its power to control you, and what once felt like a void becomes a place where you finally stand on your own. And then, almost quietly, without the kind of drama you once imagined would mark this moment, something settles inside you. Not a sudden burst of strength, not a declaration to the world, but a steady, grounded knowing. You're not going back. By now, you've seen the patterns. You've felt the pull, resisted it, questioned yourself, sat with the discomfort, and stayed. You've watched the cycles try to restart in different forms, through warmth, through guilt, through silence. And each time, something in you chose differently. Not perfectly, not without doubt, but differently enough to change the direction of your life. And this is where your power begins to solidify. Because power, in this sense, is not about dominance or control over someone else. It's not about proving a point or making them see what they've done. It's about alignment. It's about your actions finally matching what you've come to understand. No more bargaining with your own boundaries. No more explaining your worth to someone who required you to shrink in order to stay. There's a quiet dignity in that. You begin to notice that the urgency you once felt, the need to respond, to clarify, to fix, has softened. It's no longer driving your decisions. You can observe a message without feeling compelled to answer it immediately. You can feel a wave of emotion without acting on it. You can remember the good moments without using them as a reason to return to what hurt you. And that doesn't mean you've erased the past. It means you've integrated it. You've allowed yourself to see both sides. The connection that felt meaningful and the cost at which it came. You're no longer choosing one version of the story over the other. You're holding the whole truth. And from that place, your decisions become clearer because you're no longer asking, do they deserve another chance? You're asking, what do I deserve now? And that question changes everything. It shifts the focus away from their behavior and back onto your own needs, your own limits, your own well-being. It brings you into a relationship with yourself that is no longer secondary. And from that place, something new begins to take shape, a sense of self-trust. Not the kind that says you'll never feel pain again, or that you'll never question yourself, but the kind that says, even if I feel uncertain, I won't abandon myself to resolve it. The kind that allows you to stay present with your experience, rather than escaping it through old patterns. And with that self-trust comes a different kind of freedom. You're no longer tied to the hope that someone else will change in order for you to feel okay. You're no longer waiting for closure that may never come in the form you expected. You begin to understand that closure is not something they give you. It's something you create by honoring what you know, by standing in your decision, by not reopening doors that cost you your sense of self. And yes, there may still be moments when the past calls to you. Moments when the familiar feels tempting, when loneliness whispers that going back might be easier than continuing forward. But those moments don't define you anymore. They pass through like waves, and you remain. Because something deeper has taken root, a commitment, not to being strong all the time, not to having it all figured out, but to not betraying yourself in the ways you once did, to not silencing your own needs in order to maintain a connection that asked too much and gave too little. And that commitment, lived out in quiet, consistent choices, becomes the foundation of a different kind of life, one where your presence is not negotiated, one where your boundaries are not questioned into submission, one where your worth is not something you have to earn through endurance. And as you stand in that place, without needing to announce it, without needing to justify it, something becomes undeniably clear. You didn't just walk away from them, you returned to yourself, and this time, you're not leaving.